All right, good afternoon, guys.
Good afternoon.
Thank you guys so much for being here with me. I love that we have a big crowd. This is a big topic for the day, and it's a rapidly evolving situation. We are talking about Iran today. For those of you who don't know, I'm Connor Hatton. I'm the Active Minds instructor here. I don't want to talk too much about myself because I want to talk about Iran. And we have a lot to cover. So I'm just going to jump right into things. Iran, we are obviously talking about because it is a rapidly developing situation. The United States is in the midst of a very fragile ceasefire with Iran, and it is a rapidly developing situation and rapidly changing. As much as last night and yesterday, there were some significant developments. So we'll try to take you as close as we can to current day. We will talk about what is going on now. But I do want to provide a little bit of context for who we are fighting. I think that is an important part of understanding this conflict. It is a very complicated conflict in many ways, and so I'd hope to orient you guys a little bit around the conflict, including all of the parties involved, so that we all have a really good baseline of kind of what's going on in the world today. So this is Iran. Iran is in the central Middle East. It is a rather large country. It is about 636,000 square miles, which is about the size of Alaska. You can kind of see it here. This is Iran inside the United States. So it makes up a pretty significant portion of the United States. It has a population of around 92 million people. So also quite a few folks living in Iran. It is 60% Persian ethnically. It is 16% Azeri, 10% Kurdish, and then the rest is sort of a mix of different ethnic groups. When we're talking about the Middle East, we do often talk about a lot of different ethnic groups. There's a lot of representation of different groups throughout the Middle East. They hold on to about 10% of the world's proven oil reserves and about 15% of the proven natural gas reserves in the world. So significant energy economy in Iran. As far as the terrain goes, that's an important aspect of talking about things when we're talking about the war in Iran and understanding what the war looks like. So Iran is kind of comprised of a couple different regions, basically 4 regions, including 2 very large mountain ranges. So down here in the southwest, we have the Zagros Mountains, which is a really significant mountain range. The highest peak there is about 18,000 feet, and it comprises most of the country, most of the length of the country. Up to the north, we also have the Elburz Mountains, another significant mountain range, and then there's a lot of desert. And there's a high plateau that is produced by the convergence of these 2 mountain ranges, which produces a lot of desert. There's not a lot of arable plains or arable agricultural land, though it does make up about 10 to 15% of the country. So most of this terrain is pretty hostile, right? It's either mountains or desert, and those are 2 very difficult environments to fight a war in. And so that's a challenge that is facing the United States right now. And we've had a lot of talk about ground invasions and the potential of a ground invasion. But a ground invasion would be going into this climate and this terrain, which is extremely hostile to soldiers, and it's extremely difficult to fight a war in the mountains. We've learned this as part of our recent history in the United States with some of our other conflicts that we've had in the Middle East. That when these rebel forces are entrenched in the mountains, they are very difficult to root out. And we end up spending a lot of time, a lot of resources, a lot of money just bombing mountains. We've been bombing a lot of mountains over the past few months, which, it does not have great levels of success. The key point of interest right now, and mostly what the conversation has been based around, is the Strait of Hormuz. The Strait of Hormuz connects the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman, leading into the Indian Ocean. And that is a primary shipping channel for much of the world. A lot of the world's oil traverses through the Strait of Hormuz, and Iran is currently closing the Strait of Hormuz as this conflict goes on. This is something that we could have foreseen as a nation, but the Strait of Hormuz narrowest point is only about 21 miles. So Iran really just has to be able to exercise control of that 21-mile corridor in order to be able to control the entirety of the Strait of Hormuz. So this was something that is kind of unanticipated, that they would be able to exert this kind of control, but it was also foreseeable in many ways. So the Strait of Hormuz remains closed right now, and that has massive ramifications for much of the world. The United States is actually probably one of the least affected nations via the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. About 25% of the world's oil traverses the Strait of Hormuz, and it mostly goes to Asia, mostly going to China, a lot of India, a lot of Japan. So those countries find themselves extremely adversely impacted by the current conflict more than anything. And we're going to talk a little bit more about what that closure looks like and how it factors into this major conflict as a whole. So I want to tee things off by just giving you an overview of the Iranian government, because that is an important jumping off point, and it's not necessarily always the clearest when we see it in the news. So the Iranian government's philosophy operates on this precept, the Wilayat al-Faqih, the guardianship of the Islamic jurist. Since the revolution in 1979, there has basically been a fundamental belief in the Iranian government that the clergy should run the government. And this is essentially what is happening. There's no separation of church and state in Iran, and in many ways they believe that the most benevolent leaders would be your clergy leaders. I think there's a logical rationale to it. This was a philosophy that was put forth by Khomeini, the Ayatollah Khomeini, in 1979, and it's what the country unified behind. So the governing structure holds the clergy at the top, and the clergy is essentially the end-all be-all of the government. But the government is broken down into the clerical aspect of the government and into the democratic aspect of the government. There are kind of two governments that are going on within the state of Iran. Within the democratic side of Iran, there are free and fair elections, sort of, happening in Iran. Iranian civilians are encouraged to elect their parliament, they elect their president, and they elect an assembly of experts. This government functions primarily with domestic policy more than anything. They are responsible for a lot of the economic policy that goes on in Iran, and they are responsible for a lot of the administration of the state. But they are definitely relegated by the clerical aspect of the government. At the top of the clerical aspect of the government, we have the supreme leader, who's just, the buck stops with him. His name today is Khomeini. And he is very new to his post. But there are a number of different government agencies that are all run by the clergy. And ultimately, they kind of supersede anything that happens in the civilian government. So it is certainly not a democracy in the sense that we think about a democracy. There are democratic aspects, but for the most part, it is a theocracy. It is run by the church, and the church essentially runs all functions, especially as it relates to foreign policy. The clergy and the Ayatollah are extremely involved with what Iran does on an international level. The other extremely important aspect of the regime, apart from the supreme leader, is the Revolutionary Guard Corps. And you may have heard about these guys a little bit over the past couple months as we've been covering this. This is the military of Iran. And it's a military that is sworn to protect the regime. It is not sworn to protect the people of Iran. It is not sworn to protect the state of Iran. It is sworn to protect the Ayatollah and the regime. So that's one important aspect of things. The second important aspect of things is that this is not just a conventional military in the military sense. They are responsible for a ton of the Iranian economy. They own the largest construction firm in the country. They own a lot of the industry in the country, and they comprise about 40% of the Iranian economy is run by the military. So they are important on a military level as well as on an economic level, and Iranian society is super intertwined with what the IRGC does. So when you hear about the IRGC, we are talking about a huge effort. It's not just like the Army in the United States, which is just subservient. They have a lot of interest. They employ a lot of people. They provide a lot of resources to people, and they fight. So this is very important to understand that it's not a military in the conventional sense. Mojtaba Khomeini is our current supreme leader, and he is very recently in charge as of earlier this year when the United States conducted our initial strikes in Tehran, which took out much of the regime, including his father, and Ali Khomeini. So he is very new, and we don't know a ton about him, quite frankly. He has been in hiding since those attacks happened. He has issued statements since those attacks happened, but he has not been on video. He has not come out publicly. There are a lot of credible reports that say he is greatly injured and that he was injured in those strikes. Some people say that he may be missing a leg and is otherwise maimed. So he is in a pretty precarious position himself. And we are trying to deal with him, but we don't always know if we are dealing with him. So there's a little bit of fog that comes over the diplomatic situation, which is one of the aspects that contributes to this conflict being so complex. So that is the kind of outline of the governmental structure, which is important to understand because for a while there, we didn't understand who we were talking to. And this was a big problem when the initial diplomatic efforts were happening. We were talking to a lot of the representatives from that civilian side of the government. But as we saw, there's extreme limitations to what the civilian government can do. So it's very important that any peace negotiations kind of go through the regime, as the regime has proven pretty stalwart, pretty stubborn, and has essentially extremely durable, more than anything. Okay, so we've got that in our minds. We're going to talk a little about the recent history in Iran, and I'm going to try to do this as quickly as possible because I do want to save as much time as possible to cover the ongoing conflict. But it's important to note that Iran is an extremely old civilization. We have traces of human activity in Iran going back about 10,000 years. It is one of the initial cradles of civilization, and some of the initial first peoples on the planet were in Iran and in the cradle of the Middle East. The early societies in Iran were very rustic and rudimentary up until about 550 BC. In 559 BC, to be exact, the Achaemenids are going to take over, and they are going to be the first Persian empire. The Persians are not native to Iran as an ethnic group. They are more of a Central Asian ethnicity. But after the Achaemenid Empire really took over, all of the Persians started to move into Iran. So that's when you're going to see your first major migration into the area, is around 550 BC. There is a long history of all of the Persian empires. It is an extremely interesting history. I wish we could spend a little bit more time with it. They were, again, very resilient. This is one of the hallmarks of Iranian and Persian society, is that they repel invaders and that they get taken over at different intervals and they take the country back at different intervals. Alexander the Great ransacked Persia and took over Persia. They took it back from Alexander the Great. It was then again sacked by the Mongols a couple centuries later. They have been invaded a number of times, and they have always proved that they can repel invaders and that they can repel empires. And that is an extreme point of pride for them and a key aspect of their national identity, is that they will not be taken over, that they will maintain Iranian sovereignty at all costs. So that's a little bit of what we're up against more than anything. And that's how they see the United States of America, is an empire that is trying to take over their country. And being that their national identity is so built around the repulsion of efforts such as that, they are extremely up in arms about what is happening, because that is who they are. They fight this. This is the belief. So we're going to just jump forward quite a few millennia, quite frankly, and talk about the early 1900s is when everything is going to start to change and when Iran is going to become modernized. And so we're going to talk about that as it leads into the Iranian Revolution and all that came after that. But at the turn of the century, the dynasty that was in control was the Qajar dynasty. And the Qajar dynasty was an extremely decentralized dynasty. It left a lot of the political control to the tribes of Iran. And it kind of prized tribal sovereignty over national unity and national sovereignty. So they were very focused on maintaining the integrity of the tribes, and the tribes were extremely empowered. But at the turn of the century and dating back into the 1800s, the Middle East became a battleground for world powers. In the 1800s, Russia and England were very much warring throughout the Middle East as a part of their kind of international game. It was much a Cold War being fought by proxies, being fought by empires in the Middle East. The Middle Easterners themselves did not have a ton of say in these conflicts. They were mostly at the behest of those empires that were coming in. In 1907, in fact, Britain and Russia got together with no Iranian input and no Iranian representation, and they divided the country between themselves in order to maintain their spheres of influence. Again, just no input from the millions of people who live there. They just decided that they were going to do this. And essentially that's what they did. The British invaded the south and the Russians invaded the north, which put heavy strain on the communities who lived there. This only got ratcheted up very early on because at the turn of the century, we start to discover oil throughout the Middle East. And the industrialization has already happened in much of Europe, in much of the United States, and oil is a huge commodity in the world at the beginning of the 20th century. So when oil is discovered in 1908 in Iran, the British get big stars in their eyes, big dollar signs in their eyes, and they move into Iran and strike a deal with some of the tribal leaders of the time. Because the Qajar dynasty empowered a lot of the tribal leaders could sell off a lot of their land, and they started to make pretty bad deals with these empires in exchange for pretty good mountains of cash coming their way. So the Anglo-Persian Oil Company is a lot of where this starts. The British came in and they established the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, and they established it on extremely favorable terms to the British. It's a crazy contract. They make something like, we're making something like 88 cents on the dollar for every piece of, that was the British profits. And then the Iranians were kind of stuck with that 18 cents. They got 18% of the revenue. And while the British got about 88% of the revenue. It's a big sticking point. They said that the Anglo-Persian Oil Company was paying more in taxes to the British government than they were paying to the Iranian people and paying into the Iranian economy. So it was an extremely unequal deal, and for many of the Iranians, it was more of the same. They had already hemorrhaged a lot of their agricultural land. They had sold off their tobacco industry in much the same fashion, just making deals with the British coming in, making deals with the Russians coming in. The Russians had been invaded a few times in the 1800s and had kept much of their land. So we were much of the Western world was actively partitioning the Middle East through that period of time. That sets the stage for this man. During World War I, Iran became a key battleground. Again, they personally had declared themselves as a neutral party in World War I. They did not want to be involved in World War I, but they were extremely close to the Ottoman Empire. They were on the border of the Ottoman Empire, and it was going to be extremely difficult for them to maintain that sort of neutrality going into World War I. This is what happens in World War I. In World War I, the British and the Russians invade Iran. Again, the Iranians do not have any say in this invasion. They have wanted to maintain themselves as a neutral party more than anything, and they get ransacked. Iran is destroyed throughout World War I. And the biggest destruction that actually happens in World War I to the Iranians is that the Russian and the British armies coming in start to use all of the resources within Iran. They take up all of the food, they take up all of the energy, they take up everything that they can to fight this war. And it leaves Iran in a great, great famine. About 2 to 10 million people died from 1917 to 1919 of starvation, of hunger, of famine, and of famine-related diseases. So they are pretty weakened during World War I, and they've shown the limitations of the Qajar dynasty, that the dynasty has no kind of international sovereignty. They can't repel invaders. They can't put up a fight when it comes to protecting the Iranian people. And the regime is fracturing. In comes this man here, Reza Shah. Reza Shah, during World War I, was an active military commander. And after World War I, he is going to rise to prominence in his defiance of the Qajar dynasty and in his advocacy for the Iranian people. In 1921, he is going to take over via an essential coup d'etat within the country and really start to administer the state through the military. In 1925, he will deem himself the Shah. The Shah is just a king by another name within the Iranian context. Importantly and interestingly, he very nearly declared Iran a republic, but they did not. Many of the foreign interests of the time did not want to see a republic in Iran. If you are an empire who wants to control other nations, it is much easier to control a regime than it is to control an entire population. So you don't always love democracy taking place in your spheres of influence. So he deems himself king instead, and he starts to rule the country, and he really starts to modernize the country. He starts to invest very heavily in the development of roads and bridges and industry. In all of these ways, Iran starts moving towards a semblance of modernization and towards a modern economy under his rule. He also builds the army up quite substantially. During World War I, the army was about 40,000 people. By the time World War II takes over, he's going to have an army about 100,000 people. So people are developing strong Iranian identity during his rule. But World War II rolls around again, and Iran is going to be unfortunately situated once again, because the British and the Russian alliance is going to require some supply lines. And the key supply line, when you're trying to circumvent Germany, is to go through the Middle East. So the British wanted to supply the Russians with goods during World War II, and the best way to do that was to use the railroad that traversed the entirety of Iran. So once again, England and Russia invade Iran. They, again, had declared full neutrality and wanted no part in World War II, yet they are brought into World War II, and much the same thing happens. There are battles in Iran during World War II, but again, mostly it's going to be famine and disease that is going to ransack and ravage Iranian communities and the Iranian population. They estimate that 3 to 7 million people died in World War II. So they are kind of suffering blows in conflicts that they don't want to be in, and they're losing millions and millions of people within their population. At that time, 3 to 7 million people made up about 25% of the Iranian population. So they've lost a quarter of their population in conflicts that they were not necessarily involved in. During World War II, Reza Shah becomes very vocal in his defiance to the Russians and to the British being involved in Iran. And the Russians and the British do not take too kindly to him talking back to them. So they depose him and they remove him from power, and they prop up his son, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. He is 21 years old when he is put into power in about 1942. He is entirely propped up by foreign regimes who think that they can manipulate him. He does not have a ton of credibility within Iran as a result. Many people see him as a foreign puppet, and they treat him accordingly. And so he doesn't have a ton of power initially coming into his seat as the Shah. in the 50s, Iran is going to become increasingly democratic, and they are going to start to lean very heavily on some of their more democratic institutions, and they are going to rely on the parliament and on the prime minister to administer much of the state while trying to actively relegate the Shah. I mean, they saw him as a foreign actor. They did not want him involved. They wanted to see their representation take place. So in 1951, this man, Mohammad Mossadegh, is elected as prime minister within Iran. He's a very charismatic leader. He's a very popular leader with Iran. And his primary issue that he is running on is the nationalization of the oil industry. He wants to take back that contract that they have with the British and redirect all of the revenue from the oil sales back into the Iranian economy. But you can imagine that the British are not going to take too kindly to that kind of policy. But this is exactly what he does in 1951. One of the first things he does upon getting into the seat of the prime minister is he nationalizes the oil industry, just as he said he was going to. But the British are not going to take too kindly to that. The United States are getting increasingly involved in the Cold War. And ultimately, they decide that that kind of leadership in that country is going to be unsustainable and untenable for the imperial interests of the time. So in 1953, the CIA and MI5 from Great Britain launch Operation Ajax. Operation Ajax was a coup d'etat that overthrew Mossadegh and reinstilled Mohammad Reza Mohammad Reza Shah, in power as the sole executor of power within Iran. So we went in and essentially deposed a democratically elected leader, threw him out, and put somebody that was more favorable to our interests in charge. This is a tale as old as time for many, many empires. But Mohammad Reza Shah is going to suffer from a crisis of a lack of credibility more than anything, because after 1953, it has become very clear to the Iranian population that foreign influence is a fact of life, and that if they want to elect somebody, that the United States and other regimes around have no problem taking out their leaders. So there's an extreme anti-imperial sentiment that starts to be born during this time. There's an anti-USA sentiment that's born during this time. And there's an anti-Israel sentiment that is going to be born in Iran during this time. Mohammad Reza Shah oversees what is called the White Revolution during his time. He very much tries to keep on the path of modernization of the Iranian economy. I don't know if anybody has seen the pictures of Iran in the 60s and 70s, but the women are in short skirts with their hair down. They are wearing Western garb. They are listening and watching Western media more than anything. And that's a big part of Mohammad Reza Shah's prerogative. He wants to push forward the Westernization and the modernization of the Iranian economy. But he's an extremely paranoid leader because he knows that nobody in Iran really respects him. So he starts being extremely deceitful. He develops a secret police with the CIA and Mossad called Savak, is what they call it. And he starts to arrest many of the political prisoners. And he starts to arrest anybody who is openly opposed to him. And he kills a number of these people and establishes camps during this time that the police are taking these prisoners to. And it's a pretty dark time in Iran, despite pretty active modernization and pretty active economic gains. Iran's GDP at the same time is becoming more and more and more substantial. But the real gains for the people are not as evenly distributed. It is mostly concentrated to the regime and some of the wealthier class within Iran. Again, he gets increasingly paranoid over time. And during the 1970s, he becomes this very, very paranoid governor. He starts telling different things to each member of his cabinet. He does not want anybody to be on the same page. He actively kind of subverts much of his government during that time because he won't trust somebody who's in charge. He's constantly looking over his shoulder for a coup to happen. And he becomes a really ineffective president, and his crisis of credibility has only devolved even further, and nobody really sees him as a viable leader. He also gets cancer in 1973, doesn't tell a soul. And many people think he experienced pretty significant cognitive decline throughout the 70s. So in 1979, in large part because of his health complications, but also because the government is really slipping away from him, the Shah leaves Iran. And it is a very symbolic move. Everybody kind of knows that the Shah will never return, but it's not explicitly said. He said he's going on a trip, but he very famously picks up a ground of dirt as he boards his plane and kisses it. And everybody in that moment kind of knows that the Shah will never return to Iran. So, as part of this crisis of legitimacy throughout the 70s, there is a big coalition of kind of unlikely friends in Iran that are all in defiance of the Shah. This includes the clergy, it includes academics, it includes the leftists, it includes many of the working class within Iran, and they are all kind of unified behind this idea of anti-imperialism. Not a ton of them want to see this kind of Islamic takeover necessarily that happens. They just want to see the Shah gone, and they want to see Iranian representation in their government and the Iranian protection of their sovereignty. So many of these unlikely kind of friends get together and they try to form a new government to take over the Shah. It is a relatively peaceful coup. There are some violent demonstrations, as well as mass demonstrations in the street to establish this new form of governance. In steps this man, Ayatollah Khomeini. So Ayatollah Khomeini had been an extremely vocal dissident of the Iranian regime. He had very much lend himself to the narrative that the Shah was a US-backed kind of puppet. He wanted to kind of instill a government that was for the people of Iran as governed by the clergy. And he was actually expelled from Iran. He was exiled from Iran in the 60s because he was such a vocal opposition to the Shah during that time. Meanwhile, he stays in Europe. He records a number of cassettes. He's kind of spouting his ideology from afar. Many people smuggle in his cassettes, and many of the people involved in the revolution are listening to him. He is extremely charismatic, and people really like him. He also has the benefit. The one place that the Shah and the kind of US-backed government couldn't touch was the mosque. Many of the community spaces that existed that were apart from political influence ended up being the religious spaces. So they had the kind of network that was necessary to establish a new government. And when the revolution actually happens, the clergy just kind of politically maneuvers themselves into power because they have the safe space, they have the kind of community infrastructure, and they have the ability to provide resources to people. So Khomeini returns in 1979, and that's exactly what happens. The revolution is, in a sense, co-opted by the clergy. And they really establish themselves very quickly as the ruling party. This is not the consensus view of everybody. Because there was that large coalition of people, many people dissent about this. And many people do not want to see the clergy in power. And initially, it looks extremely fragile. It does not look like the regime is going to be able to consolidate power. But a few things happen in the years following. In 1979, going into 1980, as part of the Iranian Revolution, a number of students attack the U.S. Embassy, and they take a number of U.S. citizens hostage for 444 days. This was, again, as a symbol of the defiance of the empire. The United States, or the Iranian people, very much believed that the United States would come back and depose the Ayatollah or depose whoever was democratically elected. And so the Iranian hostage crisis was about keeping the United States from doing just that, from executing another coup on Iranian territory. This is the time where the United States severs all diplomatic relations with Iran and where Iran is going to become an extreme adversary of the United States, and they have been an adversary of the United States ever since 1979 to 1980. Ultimately, we got the hostages out. Very cool operation, acting as a Canadian film company, and they are smuggled out. But something else happens in 1980, and Iraq and Iran go to war. Saddam Hussein, who is in power in Iraq, also sees the Iranian government as extremely fragile. And he thinks that because there's this new government that probably doesn't have a ton of popular support, that he can make extremely quick gains into Iran, that he could gain a lot of territory really quickly and win an outright war in Iran with no problem at all. And so he invades Iran. And he is quickly kind of humbled, because this conflict is going to go on for 8 years. It's going to be an immense conflict. 500,000 people are going to die in this conflict. It is one of the bloodiest conflicts that happens in the world post-World War II. Much of the Western world supports Saddam Hussein in this war. All of Europe supports Saddam Hussein. The United States supports Saddam Hussein. Iran, again, is left diplomatically ally-less. And they increasingly rally behind this identity that nobody is coming to save Iran. Everybody just wants to destroy Iran, and all regimes must be expelled from Iran. So this really solidifies the identity, and there's a huge rally behind the flag effect that happens. And this kind of rally behind the flag is what is going to legitimize the Ayatollah and the Islamic regime, because now they will have popular support. In 1979, they did not have popular support. But going on 1988, they have consolidated all sorts of power. They have established the IRGC, and they have established themselves as a viable regime that is willing to defy empires. And that's a big deal for the Iranian. Concurrently, there is something very important happening in the Middle East that is going to change the Middle East fundamentally. In 1947, the United Nations decides to establish the State of Israel in what was Palestine. This is going to fundamentally rub many of the Muslim communities and many of the Arab communities the wrong way. In large part because this was not negotiated with any parties from the Middle East. It was kind of an abject decision that was made unilaterally at a very high level to establish the State of Israel, such that the Holocaust would never happen again. Israel, over the years, and very immediately after being established, starts to go to war with its neighbors. Some of those wars are started by Israel, some of those wars are started by the neighbor. But in many ways, the Arab world starts to see Israel as a problem within the Muslim world. And in many ways, they are, because they start to push their territory, and they start to claim territories in and around the initial establishment of Israel. And they start to marginalize the people of Palestine. So this is something that the Iranians can relate to. They feel extremely marginalized by many of the actions that have been taken on kind of a higher level. And they relate extremely well to the Palestinians. And they view themselves as the defenders of the Palestinians more than anything. The Palestinians, meanwhile, are going to be fighting the entire time. They have always provided opposition to Israel, but Israel has always been better manned and better gunned than the opposition. In the 80s as well, much of the Palestinian opposition is going to move into Lebanon, and they are going to fight the war from Lebanon. In 1982, there was going to be a major Lebanese civil war. It's important to note that the Lebanese state has also never been a strong state. They do not have a lot of consolidated government. They do not have secure borders. They do not have, just a government that can administer the state. They are extremely weakened politically, and they're almost a failed state in many sense of it. Many of the people do not rely on government institutions. They cannot rely on government institutions, and it's a lot of local tribal economies. So fighting a war in Lebanon is very interesting because you are not necessarily fighting the state, you are fighting all of the parties that are within Lebanon. So Israel moves into Lebanon in 1982 in the midst of that war, in the spirit of exterminating the resistance, in the spirit of getting rid of the Palestinian Liberation Operation, which was the operating government for the Palestinians at that time. And they move in Lebanon and they start to attack pretty indiscriminately. And they attack communities, they attack anywhere they think might be some of that opposition, and they destroy a lot of their relationships during this time. And they also make everybody dislike them quite a bit more in southern Lebanon and throughout much of Lebanon. This is when Hezbollah is going to be formed. Hezbollah is primarily concentrated in Lebanon, and it is primarily as a Israeli kind of repelling force more than anything. Their sole purpose is to make sure that Israel does not creep more than they already have. And it's in large part in reaction to Israel moving and creeping all around every chance they get. So Hezbollah is an extremely important party now. But Iran starts to see these kinds of things happening in the Middle East. And they have just established themselves in the wake of the Iran and Iraq War as a significant force within the region. They have a fairly robust economy, and now they are taking in all of these oil revenues, as well as benefiting from this massive, population of, probably 60 or 70 million people at this time. So Iran starts to champion itself, and they start to establish themselves as the defender of the Muslim world against the incurring empire. This is their big thing, and they establish what they call the axis of resistance. Iran starts to fund many of these groups, and they start to send a ton of military support and military training into Lebanon to support Hezbollah, into Palestine to support Hamas, into Yemen to support the Houthis. And they start to build all of these little rebel forces throughout the Middle East. Many of these groups operate in what we call a state within a state within these countries. Hezbollah is not just a military, for example. They provide a lot of social welfare. They build schools, they build roads, they provide kind of money to people who can't afford to live in any given moment. They do a lot of community building as well. Same with Hamas, same with the Houthis. They establish themselves as states that people can rely upon when they can't rely upon the state itself. So they gain credibility via this community building. Whether you believe what their mission is or not, they are making inroads in their communities. And this is why they have such a strong political foundation within any of these countries. Iran also doesn't want to fight wars in Iran. The United States doesn't want to fight wars in Iran or in the United States. Russia doesn't want to fight wars in Russia. So we have always engaged in proxy wars. We've always tried to fight wars away from us while still asserting our national interests. And Iran is going to do the same thing. They believe that they can build a proxy network that can effectively repel these empires without them ever reaching and devastating Iran. So that's a lot of their operating theory, is that they are going to protect the Middle East, they are going to fight wars in these other countries, and that they are going to insulate themselves from the consequences of war. Meanwhile, Israel has continued to push forward. And after the establishment of many of these proxies, they are very surrounded. Israel is surrounded by Hamas in Palestine. They are surrounded by Hezbollah to the north. We got the Houthis across Saudi Arabia to the south. But they are facing threats from many different places, existentially, including Iran. So this man here, Benjamin Netanyahu, is elected in the 90s. And his primary mandate from his election on up until today has been to have an all-out war with Iran and to bring the United States into that all-out war with Iran. Because what he sees as the solution to this kind of predicament that they find themselves in is to destroy the entire network. He wants to see Iran and all of their little proxies decimated. as much as possible, and then Israel kind of has license to do whatever they want if they can get that strategic goal accomplished. The United States has been extremely hesitant to join in that conflict. We have seen what our interventions in the Middle East have done. They are extremely costly, they are extremely difficult, and up until now, we have resisted his call. He has spoken before Congress on multiple occasions during his tenure in the Israeli government, and each time he has called for war with Iran more than anything else. He's been lobbying for this for about 40 years in his political career. So this is a very big moment for Bibi Netanyahu, and it's a very much a point of personal pride. So the United States, in our objectives in this conflict, we have very clearly outlined that we want to make sure that Iran does not gain access to a nuclear weapon, and that their nuclear program is at least set back at least a decade, so that they cannot have a nuclear weapon. Because if we have nuclear armament in the region, we start to see more threats to national interest, we start to see more threats to Israel, and that is just something that we do not want to happen, is a nuclear Iran. So Iran's nuclear program, it's important to note, started in the 60s as part of Dwight Eisenhower's Atoms for Peace. After we dropped the bombs on Japan, we decided that the best way to make sure that nothing like that ever happened again and make sure that nobody dropped nuclear bombs on anybody was to give nukes to everybody, or at least nuclear power to everybody and nuclear technologies. So the United States actually started the Iranian nuclear program, and we sent over much of our infrastructure, much of our technology, and much of our people to establish the first nuclear sites in Iran. Iran, since then, has been kind of developing a nuclear weapon in fits and starts, and they are in the process of ramping up their refinement more than anything. It was found in the early 2000s that Iran was hiding a few key nuclear sites from oversight agencies, and that very early on in the 90s and in the 2000s, they were very much seeking to create a nuclear bomb. That is when we discovered Fordo and Natanz, which are the two sites that we bombed last year, during the 12 Days War. But those were previously hidden from the International Atomic Economic Agency. They are energy agency. They had hidden those things because they were seeking that nuclear bomb, and they were refining the uranium necessary for a nuclear bomb. But let me see. Okay. Well, the note on the Iranian nuclear sites is that they probably ceased trying to develop a nuclear weapon in about 2003. They really decided that it wasn't worth it to continue to develop a nuclear bomb, in large part because the United States and the rest of the global economy came down extremely hard on them for having tried to develop a nuclear bomb. There were rampant sanctions from every country in the world upon Iran, and they stifled the Iranian economy, and they are still stifled as an economy. Iran's economy has lagged behind significantly the world's economy as a result of those sanctions and as a result of the punishment that the rest of the world has dished out to Iran, more or less. Within Iran, this has also created a lot of social struggles. There have been some major movements within Iran that are against the regime and very much trying to not necessarily overturn the regime, but at least get the regime to compromise some of its more strict positions. In 1999, because of the economic struggles that many were experiencing, there was a large student movement. These movements in Iran are massive. Millions of people take to the streets. In 2009, they had the Green Movement, which similarly was about social repression and economic rights. And then in 2017 to 2021, there were significant economic protests that called for the overthrow of the regime. So domestically, the Iranian people have been expressing themselves, and in large part expressing themselves in contrast to the regime, as opposed to the regime. It's very difficult right now for us to know what Iranian public opinion is. There is not really a freedom of press. The internet has been largely turned off in Iran. What we do know is that there were massive protests in January of this year as well, and that the Iranian regime cracked down heavy upon those protests. They likely killed 12 to 13,000 people in 1 or 2 nights of protests. It was an extremely oppressive reaction to a public display of defiance. That said, there are likely still many people within Iran that support the regime. And there are so many people who are coalescing behind the regime. So public opinion is likely split within Iran, and it's probably important that we note that as we have these conversations about regime change, is how idealized is the idea of regime change if half the population kind of supports the regime. In 2022, these protests, the most recent protests, really began, and they have really continued since 2022. They were inspired by the killing of this young woman here, Mahsa Amini, who was walking through the street without her hijab on, and she was picked up by the police and beaten to death, and they left her body on the side of the road. It was an extremely violent killing, and it angered a lot of the Iranian people. And the hijab and the right to not wear it has been a major point of contention between the regime and the people of Iran. There are many women who want to take that hijab off, who are mandated to cover their face and their head in public. So when she was killed, protests took off along the streets, and that is the protest that we are talking about when we talk about January of this year, is a lot of that social pushback, a lot of the economic pushback. It's a lot of anger and suffering that is being expressed in those protests. Iran has run at about 40% inflation for about the last 3 decades. It's been extremely difficult to live in Iran, and it's extremely difficult to live there now. The IRGC and the regime subsidize a lot of food, and they subsidize a lot of goods as a result. They control most of the money because they control the oil, and they control construction, and they control all major industries within Iran. So the people are very much kind of at their behest. In response to many of the economic sanctions that were ongoing in the early 2000s that were decimating the Iranian economy, Iran decides to come to the table for nuclear discussions. And they decide that they are going to be willing to have that conversation at a high level. At this point, again, they have not been seeking a nuclear weapon for about 12 years. The last evidence we have of them seeking a nuclear weapon prior to the JCPOA was about 2003. So they're willing to talk about their nuclear program at this point, and the United States starts to engage Iran diplomatically through back channels. We negotiate this thing over the course of 2 years. Again, since the Iranian hostage crisis, we have not formally maintained diplomatic relations with Iran, so this is a big deal that we are talking to them. And in 2015, we announced the JCPOA, which is what is called the Iranian nuclear deal. It's Obama's deal that he made with the Iranians. This deal had its flaws. It's a little short. I mean, it was only supposed to go through 2030, but it was going to be a significant step back for the Iranians. They agreed to only mine uranium up until about 20%. That's a huge point when we're talking about nuclear programs and the development of a nuclear bomb. Civilian nuclear infrastructure requires uranium refined to about 3 or 4%. And that can run a power plant, is if you run with that. Research purposes generally goes up to about 20 or 30% is the reason you'd have that kind of high grade uranium. A nuclear weapon requires about 90% of refined uranium. And so whenever a country goes over 30%, we kind of know that they are in pursuit of a nuclear bomb because there's no real reason to not do that. They agreed to those stipulations, and they said they would not refine uranium any further and that they would invest in their civilian infrastructure in exchange for the relief of sanctions and in exchange for some of their funds to be released throughout the global economy. So this was the deal. Donald Trump is elected in 2016 and comes into power in 2017. One big aspect of the JCPOA, of the Obama nuclear deal, is that it was done without the Israelis. The entire deal was negotiated with no input from the Israeli government, and they took extreme offense to that. And they have since called the deal insufficient. They've called it the worst deal they've ever seen, in large part because it didn't involve attacking Iran. They have always wanted to use the nuclear issue as the wedge issue to get the United States involved. So the fact that the United States had negotiated a solution to this problem was a big problem for them, because it meant that the United States would not be going to war with Iran anytime soon, and that they would stay in the predicament they're in. So in 2018, Benjamin Netanyahu gets up on stage and he does a presentation, much like the one I'm doing today, on the Iranian nuclear program. And he uses all evidence from pre-2003, but he finds a lot of documentation that supports the fact that Iran had been seeking a nuclear weapon. And his primary audience is Donald Trump and the Trump administration during that time. Effectively, with that speech and some additional lobbying, he convinces Donald Trump that this is a horrible deal. And he convinces Donald Trump that we need to step out of the JCPOA, and that's exactly what we do in 2018. Donald Trump is convinced to pull out of the deal, and the deal is null and void. This is a graph showing the months between September 2011 to February of 2024. This is all of the time. This is the amount of centrifuges refining uranium within Iran. During the nuclear deal, they had active oversight of their nuclear program. They were submitting to observers within the country. They showed everybody what was happening at all of their nuclear sites, and they were compliant. They were absolutely compliant, and they even ticked down their nuclear development, for the most part, within Iran, in compliance with the JCPOA. After we pull out of the nuclear deal, Iran immediately puts their foot on the gas, because they see that, again, there is an imperial reaction to their actions, that diplomacy with these large nations does not work for them. And they start to refine uranium at levels not before seen in Iran. It is believed that Iran has very significant reserves of at least 60% refined uranium. That refinement level only requires them a couple more months of refinement to have a nuclear weapon. Many people believe that they may have 90% refined uranium. We do not know where that uranium is now, and we do not know what's going to happen to that. We know that some of it is under Fordo and Natanz, and that is all covered by the bunker-busting bombs that we sent in July of last year. But for the most part, we don't know where this uranium is, and we know that they have the infrastructure to continue the development of that. So the nuclear deal is blown out of the water. Iran is getting more and more emboldened. They have, again, had all of the sanctions put back on them. They have had all of their assets frozen. They are extremely upset. In enters the most recent conflict within the Middle East. October 7th of 2023, Hamas launched a major series of terrorist attacks in the Israeli state, and they killed about 1,200 Israelis over the time. They attacked synagogues, they attacked concerts, they attacked whatever they could. It was a big, big effort, and it was a devastating event for Israel. It was a very sad event. Since then, Israel has used that event as justification for a wholesale war against Gaza. Under the auspices of destroying Hamas, which Gaza is not entirely represented by Hamas. There are many people who live in Gaza who do not support Hamas, who want nothing to do with Hamas, who would rather see peace than anything. But Israel has been indiscriminate in their retaliation for the events of October 3rd. They have destroyed Gaza. They have displaced about 1 million people, and they have killed about 80,000 Gazans over the past couple of years. It's been an extremely devastating and one-sided conflict. There has not been a lot of things that the Palestinians can do to fight back against Israel. Hamas continues to send missiles their way, and Hezbollah has joined in. This is important to note that Hezbollah, as part of this war right here, has seen themselves as the defenders of Gaza, and they have started to launch attacks from Lebanon. So now Hezbollah is in the war, and Hamas is in the war. The only people we need to get in the war from an Israeli perspective to be able to destroy them all is Iran. So in 2025, again, much in part because we have information, we have intelligence, the Israelis have kind of co-opted us into this revenge mission that they have. We launched a series of attacks in 2025, and this is attacks from Israel and it's attacks from the United States. And we go in with the explicit goal of decimating the nuclear development. So we attack Fordo and we attack Natanz, and we send in huge bunker busters, and we ostensibly accomplished the mission directive, although the uranium is still there. And that's a big point of conflict right now, is that the uranium is still under all of that rubble somewhere. But we go in with these big bombs. Israel and Iran exchange fire for a while. Hezbollah does get involved, but ultimately this war only lasts about 12 days. And tensions do somewhat simmer, and the United States is comfortable with having done the damage that we did, and yada, yada, yada. We're feeling pretty good about things. But since the beginning of this year, Benjamin Netanyahu has been more and more adamant about the destruction of Iran. In some ways, this is the opportune moment that he has convinced Donald Trump of. In other ways, he's playing on his ego. He is saying to Donald Trump, you can do the thing that every other US president has been afraid to do for the last 3 decades. You can be the charge. You can be the one to destroy Iran. In other ways, he's saying, Russia has been one of the primary military allies of Iran for the last few years. And Russia is engaged in a major conflict with Ukraine. They can't necessarily send a lot of support to Iran. This is a good moment to take them out if you are ever going to take them out. And so there's a combination of kind of political influences going on. Meanwhile, because Israel is still being attacked by Hamas, they're still being attacked by Hezbollah, they are still decimating Gaza, they are occupying the West Bank. There's a lot going on. But Benjamin Netanyahu convinces Donald Trump to start this war. He convinces Donald Trump to launch Operation Epic Fury in January, February of this year. One of the biggest missions of this was, and again, just in terms of the opportune moment, was that first strike that took out the Ayatollah. Much of the Iranian leadership was in one building at one time, and we were convinced that if we took out a lot of the people within the regime, that the regime would fracture. This was sold to us and sold to Donald Trump and the administration as a very short, very effective war that would accomplish a lot and, gain us all sorts of prestige, all sorts of power, all sorts of economic gains. That has not been the case. The regime has proven extremely resilient. We did not take into account Iran, since 1979, has been planning to be bombed. They've been planning to be invaded. For much of their history, they have been invaded. They have made their infrastructure disperse. They have hidden much of their nuclear program. They have hidden all of their weapons. They have used those mountains. They have used that desert because for 40 years, they have been preparing for this exact thing. And they have been preparing for the Ayatollah to be assassinated. And they have been preparing to lose members of their military. And it's kind of this next man up ideology that has persisted. But we gave them decades to develop the kind of plan that they would need to repel a force of ours, and we kind of disregarded that. So now we find ourselves in a very complicated situation. The other aspect of this war that has really gone off the rails and become something that the United States has no control over is that Israel has opened a major front into Lebanon, ostensibly to destroy Hezbollah. This is their explicit stated goal. Again, Hezbollah is a state within a state. If you're going to destroy Hezbollah, you have to attack civilian infrastructure. They have killed 3,300 to 3,600 people within Lebanon since the invasion earlier this year, and they have started to occupy much of southern Lebanon, and they continue to push forward. So Iran has tied their interests to the Lebanese interests in much of the ceasefire and peace negotiations that are ongoing. And the United States right now seems to want to stay out of this war as much as we possibly can. But Donald Trump and all of the administration have been talking about how this war is over, how all of our objectives were accomplished, how the deal is imminent, all of these things. But Iran has said that any ceasefire and any peace negotiations need to include Lebanon. Israel has not stopped attacking Lebanon, and they are not going to stop attacking Lebanon anytime soon. This is their MO. This is much of what they did in Palestine and in Gaza, where they would talk about the peace negotiations going on while systematically bombing Gaza day in and day out. And so they save face on an international level while creating rampant destruction throughout. And this has taken the control of the war outside of the hands of the United States. We cannot unilaterally end this war any longer because of the conflict in Lebanon today. The Strait of Hormuz is probably the key focus right now. We have the Operation Freedom, which is the naval blockade and the freeing of passage through the Strait of Hormuz. We've all seen the economic repercussions of the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. Oil is at nearly $100 a barrel today, and it is stifling the global economy. And those effects are going to continue to ripple through the global economy. Again, the United States is one of the least affected by this closure of the Strait of Hormuz. We have mostly affected Asia, we have affected large parts of Africa, and many of them face significant oil shortages, which destroys your entire economy. So this is today. This is what we're talking about today. Tensions flared just last night, and Israel and Iran exchanged missiles for the first time in months as of last night. What happened in this particular flare-up was Iran had drawn that hard line. They had drawn a red line in their negotiations with the United States in part of the ceasefire. And they told the United States that Israel could not bomb Beirut without facing consequences, without facing retaliation. Initially, Donald Trump held a phone call with Benjamin Netanyahu. And they said that Donald Trump was yelling at Benjamin Netanyahu and calling him all sorts of names and telling him to stop attacking Beirut, and that he pulled away from a plan that he had to attack Beirut. But last night, they attacked Beirut, and they attacked a small suburb of southern Beirut, and Iran kept their part of the bargain, and they retaliated with strikes on Israel. These were relatively small strikes so far, but it does demonstrate how fragile this situation is and a little bit how out of control it is, because the United States, again, cannot unilaterally end this war. The big question today on everybody's mind, and one of the things that has started to go into effect today, is that the Houthis in Yemen are looking to close the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. This is the Strait of Hormuz. This is where most of the goods traversing the Middle East and trying to escape the Middle East go. In lieu of that, they pass through the Red Sea and through this strait of Bab el-Mandeb. The Houthis are threatening to close this strait now. And so there would be no exit for oil or goods out of the Persian Gulf. Or not out of the Persian Gulf, but out of the Red Sea and the Gulf of Oman. Yeah. So this is the big problem here, is that no traffic would move out of these places. And this is the big threat today. As of this morning, the Houthis said that they are only attacking Israeli ships. That could very well change. That is exactly how the closure of the Strait of Hormuz started. That is exactly how many of these closures have started, is they initially closed down to the Israelis, and then as the conflict ratchets up, they increasingly express their leverage. This is the big thing that we found out about Iran, that we should have known going into it. But that they have major control over major choke points in the global economy. And that is not something that we can easily take away from them. So this is the situation today. The other situation that is ongoing is the unfolding of the United States and Israeli political relationship. We do not know how this is going to go. We do not know if Donald Trump, again, seems to really want to get out of this conflict. He has seen how unpopular it is in the United States, and we have elections coming up. So he wants to get out of that. He wants to see cheaper prices ahead of elections so that he can claim a lot of victory and try to turn that into political gains. Benjamin Netanyahu is not letting him get out of this conflict so easily and continues to try to bring the U.S. deeper and deeper into the conflict. Meanwhile, we have a deal that is expiring this year with Israel of a military partnership that we established about 10 years ago, where we were injecting about $3 billion into their military annually. And we have a new bill that is in the House of Representatives right now that would only increase our partnership with Israel militarily. It would include full cooperation of our militaries, full exchange of technology, and full exchange of funds. So we are on the precipice of getting closer to Israel formally on a legislative level. That is a big question right now. Will we go forward with that? Or will we take this opportunity to kind of distance ourselves from Israel? We are trying to make this the Israeli war, but we are having a hard time doing that. We still have massive aircraft carriers surrounding Iran. We can still execute kind of strikes at the drop of a hat. We can still very easily get re-involved in this conflict. But it does seem as though the United States wants to get out of it. But the conflict in Lebanon is not stopping. Israel is going to continue to bomb Lebanon, and Iran is going to bomb U.S. military bases and U.S. military personnel throughout the Middle East as long as Israel continues to push into Lebanon. So we are in a quagmire, and we are surprised we are in a quagmire in the Middle East for some reason, like we haven't been in 5 of them in the last couple decades. So this is the tense situation that we find ourselves in, and we'll see what happens. But Iran does not seem to be backing down. They do seem to have lost some military capability, but they know what they have in the Straits. They know what they have in the economic control, and they have a lot of leverage in these negotiations. A lot of these negotiations are taking place to get us back to where we started. To open passage, the free passage through the Strait of Hormuz is our primary goal. And guess what was open and free prior to the war? Was the Strait of Hormuz. So we are finding ourselves extremely limited in this situation. And it's ongoing, and we'll see what happens. But the next few days are critical. And this thing can boil up and down anytime. We have not signed a deal. It does not seem like we are going to anytime soon, quite frankly. Any questions? It is certainly complex, that is for sure. Yeah, any questions, guys? Okay, any clarification? Yeah, go ahead.
The ships that pass through Hormuz, I understand that Iran has a way of giving passes to ships that are heading for Iran and moving product and whatever. And there's no way to detect it. And I guess other ships are also using passes and stuff that they can't. The satellite cannot. They do something. They do something within the ships, so the satellite cannot detect where these ships are even going, or the ship period.
Yeah.
Can't detect it.
So
what are they doing about that?
So talking about some of the pirate operations that are happening within the Strait of Hormuz right now, there is some traffic that is going through the Strait of Hormuz, and a lot of that is in partnership with the Iranian government. We've seen a couple Chinese ships get out of the Strait of Hormuz, and we've seen some other ships that probably have gotten out. There is some smuggling going on when you have that closed down, and Iran has gotten very good at this over the years. Iran has been smuggling oil out of the country for a number of years, and they have a lot of different ways to do this, including by land, including via other straits and stuff. They've been repressed for a number of years, or oppressed for a number of years. So they've gotten pretty good about finding ways to get their oil out. She's asking, how is this happening, more or less? The Strait of Hormuz right now is kind of controlled by a series of it's a small boat fleet and some mines that the Iranians have laid over time. On the end of the Strait of Hormuz is the U.S. naval blockade. There are not a lot of ships getting past the U.S. naval blockade, and in fact, we shot one today that was trying to escape the naval blockade. But many freighters are encouraged to get with the Iranian government to speak to the Iranian army to navigate passage, and many of them are paying upwards of $2 million per boat to get them through the Strait of Hormuz. And that was a lot of the situation that was going on before the blockade. Since the blockade, there's far less of that going on. And the United States put in the blockade in large part to stop any sort of that renegade revenue from getting out of the Strait of Hormuz. So there's very little of that happening. Ships can do what you were talking about. They can turn off their navigation systems. They can fly different flags to try and skate by. But it's not a lot getting through right now. There were more getting through up until a couple days ago when the strait was essentially closed off again. But the strait usually sees hundreds of ships pass through it each day. And even at the height of the passage through the strait, it was about 25 ships a day during this conflict. So there's a lot of oil that remains stuck in the Strait of Hormuz. They are getting it out in sort of any way they can. I think a lot of it's probably on roads now, because they have to get a lot of their oil over to China, who essentially buys all of their oil. So not a lot going on. Yeah.
When did they start laying those bombs or those
The mines?
The mines, and why?
So as soon as they were attacked, I mean, this has been the plan. Like I said, they've had 40 years to prepare for what they're going to do, and they have a full military reaction. If the United States bombs us today, here's exactly what's going to happen. And it's essentially this trigger point. So one of the first things that Iran has always, probably planned to do was close the Strait of Hormuz, and they've always had a military strategy around it, which was to lay those mines. And to have these small boat fleets, because they kind of understand that they don't have naval superiority over the United States or even over Israel, for that matter. So sending large naval ships into the Strait of Hormuz was never going to be a good strategy for them. But in terms of why they closed the Strait of Hormuz, it's for economic control and to force the United States' hand more than anything, and to demonstrate that they are no small player. There was a perception that Iran would keel over and just surrender immediately. That was never their plan. They always wanted a good fight.
So you're saying they just recently put those mines in?
Yeah, they laid the mines pretty immediately as the conflict happened. And the Strait of Hormuz was open a few days after that conflict, before they had started laying mines. Mm-hmm.
So how much traffic is going through the Gulf of Oman compared to
The Red Sea?
Yes, the Red Sea.
It's more now than it usually is. This is a much smaller strait, typically. But all of the Saudi Arabian oil that went through the Strait of Hormuz is now moving through the Bab al-Mandeb Strait. And a lot of traffic has been forced into there. So the traffic is significantly higher over the past few months through this particular strait. There's a huge oil pipeline that traverses Saudi Arabia, and Iran has started bombing that oil pipeline quite a bit as well, because they want to cut off all revenue to Middle Eastern economies that support the United States more than anything else.
So aren't there alternative routes that these ships are, even if it's very long and expensive, like around the Cape and so forth, you hear about?
Well, so asking if there are other alternatives for your exports. There really are not many. And they're not exactly safe. I mean, most of the land up here is in pretty direct conflict right now in terms of Lebanon, Israel, Palestine. Iran is right over here. They are not letting as much as they can get through. There's a bit of a Cold War that's going on in the Middle East. There's a lot of U.S.-backed governments in the Middle East. We've made a lot of people very rich throughout the Middle East. But the establishment And the kind of reason that the Saudi Arabian regime still exists and holds so much power today is because they are extremely economically financed by the United States. The UAE is a US-backed state. Qatar is a US-backed state. I mean, it's devolving into a regional question more than anything, and it always has been. It's kind of been a regional Cold War. So Iran is trying to stop all revenue going to these states as well, because that's the best they can do. They don't have, the other component of the nuclear debate is always the ballistic missile and how far that can go. And they're not close to having a ballistic missile that could reach the United States. They're still even a little bit far from Europe. They could probably hit South Europe if they wanted to. But for the most part, they have to attack what's in the Middle East, and they have to try to decimate their economies such that they put pressure on us to stop attacking the region entirely and to get out of the region entirely. So there's not a lot. I mean, oil is still getting through any which way I'm sure people can. And there's probably some ways that they're not telling us about right now because they don't want to see those closed. So, you know, most of this would be by road if you can't go through either strait. Right now you can pass through the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. So until this is closed, this will probably be the primary avenue. But if it does get closed, as the threats were this morning, then we're going to have to get more creative. And all of these companies are going to have to get more creative.
And even there was pipelines, I think it was from Saudi Arabia, that they bombed
Yeah.
some of the main centers.
Yeah.
So that's the bad.
Saudi Arabia has a huge oil pipeline that is responsible for transiting the entire length of the country. So they've always been a little wary of the Strait of Hormuz closing, and they've had infrastructure in place to deal with that. They have said that they're going to just siphon it through their pipeline down to the south part of the country and go out this way. Iran has been bombing that pipeline for that reason exactly, is that they still want to decimate that industry as much as possible, even though Saudi Arabia was somewhat prepared for this eventuality. Yeah, big deal. Yeah, one more.
I was going to say, in Iran, is there a breaking point that you see that it'll be backed up, that they just can't go on doing this because they're the ones that need to get things out?
Yes, okay. Is there a point that Iran would reach where they could fracture or at least back down a little bit? It's a fantastic question. A lot of it deals with the fact that the regime is a little bit separate from the people of Iran. The Iranian people are suffering right now, and they will continue to suffer. And so the regime itself has tons of money, they have oil, they have weapons, they're all hiding in mountains, they can't administer the state very much. It's a lot of like, how benevolent is the regime? How much do they care about helping the Iranian people? Because the economic closure of the strait has really dramatically impacted Iran. Again, we don't have great insight into the daily life of Iran, but there's not a lot of meat, there's not a lot of food staples available. People are struggling to find medication, they're struggling to find food. If the Iranian government and the regime says, that's enough, we can't watch our people suffer, then there may be a red line. If the Iranian regime goes, we only care about the survival of the regime, and Iranians will have to make the ultimate sacrifice, and we are okay with that, then this could go on much longer. So it's a big question of what is the position of the Iranian regime as it relates to the regular Iranian, which is a big question. Again, the IRGC is sworn to defend the regime. They are not sworn to defend the people of Iran. And much of the allegiance is to the revolutionary movement rather than to the state. So it's very complicated, yes. Middle East is so complicated. Well, thank you guys so much for coming. I'm glad we did that. My pleasure.